Now let us listen to the explanation of our friend Dr. Craig Blomberg. And our question for him is, why do you believe that Apostle Peter is the rock in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18?
Hello, my name is Craig Blomberg. I am privileged to have the title of Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Denver Seminary, where I have taught for the last 35 years. And I am even more privileged to have been invited by Duane Cartujano, or is it Cartujano? I have not even heard his name pronounced, and I apologize for that, to give this about 10-minute reflection on my understanding of Matthew chapter 16, verses 12 through 19, verses 13 through 19, the famous passage in which Peter acknowledges, after several faulty suggestions by others, who Jesus really is. In fact, let's read that. I'm going to read out of the New International Version, which says, beginning at Matthew 16:13, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom, of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." What is Matthew teaching us here? Quite a bit of Jesus' ministry has elapsed so far. The disciples and Jesus are traveling outside of the country of Israel to its north, near the region of a city that had been renamed actually in recent years after both the Caesar, the Roman emperor, and one of the Herods, Herod Philip, a brother of the man we know as Herod the Great, who ruled over some of the territory near Israel. It's a very apt location, therefore, for Jesus to ask his own followers, in a world where the emperor was often deified, in a world where local kings or client kings were often overly exalted, who do people say the Son of Man is? Jesus' characteristic and favorite way of referring to himself, although until you get used to that, it sounds like he's talking about somebody else. But it's very clear by the time we get to verse 15 that he is talking about himself, because he says, "What about you? Who do you say I am?" So at first, in verse 14, they give some of the wrong answers. Some say John the Baptist. That's what Herod Antipas had said back in chapter 14. Others say Elijah. Jesus said John the Baptist was, if you like, Elijah returned. Others pick a different prophet, including Jeremiah. But what about the 12? Jesus asks them pointedly. And Peter, as so often, speaks for the group. and says, "You are the Messiah, the Christ," the word that translates the Hebrew anointed one, Mashiach, the Son of the living God. Not sure what all Peter understood about that at this stage. Sometimes Jews used the term Son of God almost interchangeably with Messiah, and they did not necessarily have in mind everything that Christians would come to understand about the anointed liberator. Sometimes they looked for merely a human king or military leader who would lead them in triumph over their enemies. Perhaps God led Peter to understand more here. We just don't entirely know. What we do know is that quickly after this episode, Peter is still not prepared for Jesus to explain, starting in verse 21, that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things and be killed, because his response in verse 22 is that he began to rebuke Jesus and say, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But for the moment, back in verse 15, the question, verse 16, the answer, Peter is right on target with what he says. And so in verse 17, Jesus replies and says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood," mere mortal human beings, "but by my Father in heaven, Yahweh, the God of Israel himself. And I tell you," verse 18, "that you are Peter." And of course, those of us who are Christians or who know this story have to try to temporarily set aside everything that we already know because we've read ahead. And imagine how Peter would have first heard this. Imagine how the first readers of Matthew would have heard this. This individual's given name is Simon, the single most common Jewish name in Jesus' day, from the Hebrew Shimon. It sounds here, therefore, as if Jesus is giving him a second name. We might think of it almost as a nickname. But then, of course, we have to remember that although the Gospels, like all the New Testament, were written in Greek, Jesus talking to his close followers would have almost certainly been talking to them in Aramaic, a language very closely related to Hebrew, which Jews who grew up in Israel learned to speak as their first language. We have in English a name that comes from that Hebrew word. The Hebrew is Kepha, and in English we have the word Cephas. In John chapter 1, much earlier than this chronologically, the first time Jesus ever meets Simon, he says to him, "You will be called Cephas," Kepha. That is Peter. In other words, these two terms, Kepha, a Hebrew word, Peter, from the Greek Petros, a Greek word, mean the same thing. And what they mean is rock. In English, we call it a rock. And that's what Jesus says here also in verse 18. "And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades," some translations say hell, it's a word picture, a metaphor, the powers of death and the underworld will not overcome it. "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." What kind of privilege is that? Well, first we have to establish who Jesus is talking about. There have been Christians down through the centuries who have wondered if he was talking about himself. And so it was, as it were, he is pointing to Peter and says, "You are Peter, but on this rock," and then it's as if he pointed to himself, I will build my church. Well, if we had a video, we might understand that if he gestured that way, but there's nothing in the text that would indicate that. Others have wondered if this refers to Peter's confession, his correct understanding of who Jesus is. On this rock of your correct confession or understanding. But again, that is not the natural way to take the words if we simply read them straightforwardly. He has just announced a new name for Simon, calling him Rock. And then he says, and on this rock, I will build my church. Now, it's pointed out that the second time he says rock, on this rock, he uses the feminine form Petra, rather than the masculine form Petros, which is the name Peter. But that's just because, as is true in so many languages, nouns have grammatical gender. It doesn't make the rock a female rock. All rocks are called Petra in Greek. If I knew Tagalog, I would give you an analogy in Tagalog, but I can't. So I don't know if you have one. But at any rate, it's not that the change from masculine to feminine has anything to do with a change of who Jesus or what Jesus is talking about. He just couldn't have used Petra both times, because that would not be a name for a man, and he couldn't have used Petros both times, because Petros wouldn't have meant a literal stone or a rock. It's very much in English as if you were to say, I'm going to call you, or you will be called Rocky, and on this rock I will build my church. So, what is this privilege that he is being given? If this is indeed Peter, if we look at what happens from this point on, we will also see in chapter 18 that all 12 apostles are given a very similar promise. Apparently, it's nothing unique to Peter. If we then go on to the book of Acts, we will see that with Peter initially as the leader of the group of apostles, but not limited to him, as the gospel moves out from Jerusalem, there are times when there is uncertainty as to whether somebody has become a genuine Christian or not. The best example of that comes in Acts 8, when Philip has been evangelizing in Samaria. And Peter